Hey everyone, it's Luke. Sorry for that editing clip. We had a computer malfunction, so we'll pick up where we left off. What were we last talking about? I think we were talking about how psychopaths run the world.
Claggart, yes, exactly. So we were talking about the main characters, Billy Budd. You know, if you look at him, he is this representative, innocent young man. I mean, there are several allusions to the figure of Adam and the Garden of Eden. You know, when he gets on the ship with Claggart, you know, he goes from a merchant to a naval vessel. He's entering sort of a fallen world, and it's kind of a matter of time before he sort of confronts a situation where he is forced to do something that tarnishes his innocence somehow.
Yeah, he doesn't fit into it. This is what I like about Billy Budd. And so, it's interesting that you compared him to Adam, right? Because he does have a speech impediment, right? He's not exactly even, you know, fully linguistically integrated into this world. And the other thing that's very interesting about Billy is that one of the scenes that I think is one of the most poignant and profound in the whole book is the priest or the minister that tries to administer or tries to convince him that he can be saved through Jesus Christ. And the minister recognizes that this man-child is so innocent that it may not even be important. It might not even really be important, that he may be untarnished enough that it may be superfluous. I thought that was a very interesting conclusion or thought to put into the mind of a minister, someone who's supposed to be an advocate of the faith.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is the minister is he's presiding over the congregation on a battleship. So it's almost like this is an image of the ridiculousness of Christianity serving the military.
Right.
So he can't do his job just because it's theoretically absurd for him to be blessing anyone to go ahead and kill someone else, you know.
Blessed are the peacemakers, right?
Yeah. So it's a sort of a covert criticism of institutional Christianity as being in bed with powerful state institutions. I think that is the point that Melville is making. But also there's the mythical example, as you say, that he sort of represents a phase of humanity that is irrelevant to Christianity because he has no original sin to bind him to the rest of the world in need of Jesus Christ's sacrifice. And he himself is a kind of Christ figure because he goes to his death, you know, in a kind of mock crucifixion by hanging, and sort of redeems the sailors from their the potential threat of mutiny, you know, which they might have gotten involved in if he was locked up and taken back to be tried on land. The sailors might think that if he can get away with killing an officer, you know, the master of arms, then we shouldn't be afraid of these officers. And, you know, Billy, by agreeing to be, you know, by facing execution, he absolves his fellow, you know, crew members of any need to rebel against authority.
Yeah, he's a sacrificial lamb, and like you're saying, I want to make sure that I have this right. You say he kills the master of arms. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean his crime is, you know, when Veer has them in the cabin, right? Veer, the Claggart goes to Veer because you know, he wants to destroy Billy Budd because his little attempts to tempt him into accepting conspiracy, you know, attempting to talk to other people about mutiny doesn't work. He's faithful to his job, and so Claggart gets frustrated and goes to Veer directly and says, you know, I suspect this guy of mutiny. You know, he was impressed from a merchant vessel, and he's suspicious to begin with, and Captain Veer wants to investigate while the two are in the same room because he thinks if Claggart accuses Budd of this, from Billy's expression, he'll be able to tell whether he's innocent or not, because he's noticed Billy Budd before. He thinks he admires him as a sailor, and he's pretty sure that whatever his reaction will be is going to tell him the truth of the matter. So,
right, and this is kind of what the Luciferian Satan figure does, right? Is that he puts a person on trial like this,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, right.
And then I was going to ask you, because I'm not really sure the naval chain of command, is the Master of Arms second in command?
No, he's pretty low down there, but he's still an officer.
Well, the only thing, we're talking about these archetypes. I was just wondering, because Lucifer, from my understanding of it, was the anointed cherubim, so he was, the second in heaven. So I didn't know if there was some sort of correlation between Lucifer and Claggart in terms of ranking on this ship.
Well, the connection is that Claggart clearly has a sort of upper class demeanor, and he's somehow fallen socially from his original world. So he's a sort of thoughtful, intellectual man who's also totally corrupt in his, emotional life, and is an efficient figure because because of his very sort of criminal nature, allows him to identify criminal acts. Except in this case, he's making it up because of his, jealousy of Billy Budd's inherent innocent nature.
There's another great analogy with Bud and being a Christ figure. Right before he dies, there's this really beautiful moment where he says, "God bless Captain Veer."
Yeah, right. Yeah,
and now that you mention it, it does sound something, along the lines of, what Christ said right before he expired, right? Like something to the effect of, I commend my spirit into your hands. Or something.
Yeah, exactly. Except in one, in one gospel, he says, why have you forsaken me?
Right.
But that, of course, is an expression of despair that is not the final emotion in the crucifixion. And
Christ had to endure that to understand the scope of the whole range of human suffering.
So if you look at the last chapter or two before Billy's execution, you see a lot of imagery involved in making you think of the last day of Christ. The Garden of Gethsemane, the minister who goes to talk to him, he kisses him on the cheek. It's kind of like a Judas kiss of betrayal, even though he's the minister. And the execution scene, you have the atmospherics that sort of take you to the scene of the tomb being rolled aside, and the angel, saying, Christ is not here. He's risen to heaven. So you have a sort of secularized version of the Christ story in the ends that came very easily to Melville, because he knew the story so well.
What about does Veer? If we're playing with these archetypes, if Veer is Yahweh or the Father, how I think we've made a pretty strong case that Billy Budd is this Christ archetype. But how would we make the case that Veer is the Father, and who identifies with his son?
Well, the interesting thing is that we have at a certain point, it's almost as though it says that Christ could be Veer's son because the age is correct, and that Billy looks like he has aristocratic blood. And so there's this sort of hint that there's sort of a symbolic father-son relationship. And, as far as his judgeship goes, if you talk about Edward Fairfax Veer, well, Fairfax Veer, the idea of fairness is the quality you should see in a judge, and the idea of Veer being, related to the idea of truth, verus. So his name sort of gives him a sort of de facto judicial identity. And of course, this sort of situation takes us into many Old Testament scenes where God is making judgments, especially in the book of Job, of course, where Job comes to God the Father as the sort of roving accuser. He wasn't the Satan the devil at that point, or the Satan figure at that point, goes to Yahweh and says, "Have you thought about this guy, Job? You know,
Yeah.
is he really as devout? He's not really as devout as you think he is, because he's just being good because you're giving him nice things as a reward. But if you didn't reward him, he wouldn't really care about you." So, you know, this archetypal scene of bringing someone to God's attention as a potential evildoer is found in the book of Job, and you know, I think Melville, who knew that book so well, was sort of drawing on that, especially since the Satan figure in the book of Job is not the figure he is in the New Testament. He is more of a sort of roving attorney, accuser, you know, prosecutor of sin. He wasn't, you know, a figure of evil per se, except as an accuser. That was his original name, Satan, is where it comes from.
Well, I mean, my reading of Job, I mean, we don't need to get into the weeds of theology, but I mean, right? I mean, God abandons Job so that Satan can do whatever he wants. So he does more than.
Yeah, right.
He's the one actually inflicting the harm on Job, not God. God allows it.
Right, God allows it. Well, there's certainly been lots of accusations against Veer as a character. I mean, a lot of contemporary readers think of him as just ordering this execution for no reason. He didn't have to do it. He could have sailed back. And technically, he should have held the guy for trial in a more suitable setting, right? So that a lot of people think that there's a sort of maliciousness in Veer, in his you know, exercise of authority against Bud, you know, which I don't buy into at all. I mean, I think it's clear that Captain Veer is a sympathetic man who's faced with a you know, impossible situation, and he acts in a way that he thinks is good for the majority of his crew. In other words, he's extrapolating the, you know, the greater good for the institution of the Navy and for the men on his ship, rather than the single case of possible you know, injustice to this one figure that he feels he has to execute, right? So he's kind of weighing the odds, morally speaking, and then doing what he thinks is for the good of the majority of the ship.
Do you really think these were his only two options? Do you really think he was presented with an either or? I mean, I don't understand, and maybe this feeds into the next question. I mean, we've covered our questions 5 through or 4 through 7 or something like that. And I think, I don't know if you want to elaborate more on this thesis that Claggart may have been a homosexual, but the real possibility of mutiny had he been kinder to Billy Budd.
Yeah, I think that was. I think that's what a lot of readers don't understand, is that how perilous the situation was at the time.
Yeah, can you maybe dramatize that for us? Because it does seem, I think, from a modern perspective, that it was just such a tragic waste of a life.
Yeah.
And it was, but maybe we can understand the ambiguity of the situation a little bit better. I think there was this particular episode, the Summers Mutiny case of 1842, that involved Melville's cousin,
Gert Gansford.
How that
was, I mean, a lot of people think that must have been some kind of partial inspiration for the story, because it's another story of summary justice on a ship of a young man whom many people thought was innocent. But of course, there are a lot of very significant differences. And, you know, Melville knew this incident well. His cousin, Gert Gansford, was lieutenant on this ship, the Summers. It was a training brig where midshipmen would go out for their training or young sailors would go out, because there was no West Point at that time. In fact, West Point was partly founded shortly after this incident because of the very nature of what happened. So this ship, the Somers, went out on a cruise in the fall of 1842. They went over to Africa, cruised around, and one of the midshipmen, a guy named Philip Spencer, who happened to be the son of the Secretary of War back in Washington, was acting strange. I mean, he was kind of a ne'er-do-well to begin with. He'd had some incidents in his past that showed that he was almost, mentally unstable.
Mm-hmm.
And he got into some secret communications with some other men on the ship. And the idea is that they would mutiny and become pirates. It was kind of an adolescent fantasy, because so many of the crew on the ship, over 100, were, teenagers. So they took it as they probably were intrigued by this idea. But this guy Philip Spencer, he got 2 other people to sort of be his ringleaders, and he started and he apparently interviewed a sailor saying, "Hey, we're going to kill all the officers and take over the ship and become pirates, and we're going to hang out on the Island of Pines." The Isle of Pines, which is just off of Cuba, it's part of Cuba now, and it was at one point was a pirate hangout in the 18th century. So it was a fantasy that they took seriously on the ship, because as soon as Philip Spencer told this other guy, he told Gert Gansevoort all about it. And that set in motion the process of trying to figure out if it was really true. And what they did was they imprisoned, or they put him in irons, Philip Spencer and these 2 other guys. And this very small number of officers were trying to deal with a situation where they didn't know how many of the rest of the crew had signed on to this idea of mutiny and piracy. So it was kind of a terrifying time for them, for a day or two, where they were trying to get more information by these guys by holding them in chains, and yet the ship was so small that they couldn't totally isolate themselves from the other crew members, and they were terrified the other crew members were going to fight to release them and then kill the officers. So what they did was the officer of the ship, a guy named Alexander Slidell Mackenzie, who came from a famous naval family, he and his officers had a sort of drumhead court, just like in Billy Budd, and decided they would hang the 3 main culprits as a way to set an example and to snuff out this idea of mutiny. And plus, they thought that they already had incriminating evidence from Philip Spencer to make this work, And the question was, the alternative would be to sail 2 or 3 days into a port where they could take them off the ship and have them tried, on land or impounded, in a port. But the thought was that they couldn't wait that long. They might be attacked overnight. These officers were totally sleep deprived and terrified of what would happen. So the analogy here to Billy Budd is a kind of a naval emergency where some kind of possible crime is taking place. Of course, in Billy Budd, he's totally innocent of any kind of crime of mutiny. On the Somers, of course, Philip Spencer was almost certainly guilty of fomenting mutiny. But when the ship got back to port in New York, there was a huge controversy, because this was the son of the Secretary of Navy, and Mackenzie was accused of judicial murder, right? So he had to face a court-martial and was exonerated. But the whole case was a huge controversy in late 1842, 1843. And Melville, of course, knew about it and mentioned it in White Jacket. He was at sea himself when all this happened. But he, of course, must have heard all the full story from his cousin Gert Gansevoort, and we don't know when exactly that conversation would have happened. But Melville, knew this story well, and there were some articles in the 1880s about the Summers Mutiny that he might have read in magazines, 2 articles. So it might have aroused his attention and gave details that he didn't know about. And he alludes to the Summers Mutiny in Billy Budd in a way that makes it seem like the need for execution was thought to be real because of the perilousness of the situation, the emergency conditions. The usual legal procedures have to be superseded because we're in a condition of emergency. The lives of the officers are threatened, right? That's true for the Summers. And for Captain Vere, he might have thought that his ship was at risk of possible mutiny if he merely put this killer of an officer in the brig. Maybe they think, well, he's a weakling, and we can do what we want. We got our way when we mutinied with the Nore, and maybe we can do this again with this guy because he's not exercising his full power as captain. So,
yeah, I think maybe if someone's listening to this for the first time, and to be honest, I need a little bit of a clarification on it, but why this is not a clear-cut case of mutiny, right? Like Billy Budd kills this man, but it's by accident, right?
Yeah, exactly.
His intention is not to kill him. Can you maybe describe that, why this is accidental and not intentional?
So Billy Budd kills Claggart with a blow to the forehead, right?
Right.
And we already know that Billy Budd is a peacemaker, but he has a bad temper. So when it's described that when he's breaking up a fight on his original merchant vessel, that he beat up a guy who was out of control. So he's very physically strong, and he's not going to sit by when his physical intervention can stop something bad from happening. He's a very muscular guy. So when Billy hears the accusation from Claggart, right, the problem is he can't reply to him because he's stuttering. He's got a speech impediment, right? And so he's so humiliated and frustrated at this accusation that he just blindly puts his fist out against Claggart and kills him because he aims a blow right to his head. Causes probably a massive cranial disruption. So he he's basically killed an officer, which is a crime.
Right, but he wasn't trying to set up
insurrection.
It was kind of, it was almost, we don't want to justify murder, but it was almost an extension of his, of his speech impediment and not being able to properly vocalize he couldn't defend himself verbally, and so the automatic systems of the body took over. Right,
but on the other hand, he has been accused of fomenting mutiny, right, from Claggart, and everyone knows that he was an oppressed man. So that there's sort of a shadow over him because he hasn't defended himself effectively against Claggart. All he's done is kill them, right? So he hasn't even said how this issue might have come up. Vere has to imagine something evil about Claggart to know why, he might have forced Budd to come down to be confronted with this charge. It's preposterous, obviously, that Billy Budd is a bad seed on the ship, but appearances are against him. Naval tradition is against him. His personal history of impressment is against him. and it's, you know, Veer doesn't have the time to turn around and sail back to port and take him and you know, give him the full benefit of the British legal system, right? He's about to engage the French warship, right? So he thinks the only thing he can do is just make this a very quick, condign punishment when he knows the guy is essentially innocent of intent to kill, right? It's a question of manslaughter, not murder. You know?
Well, so maybe we should just bring this session to a close.
Yeah.
Maybe talking a little bit, if you want to, a little bit about the critical reception of this text and whatnot.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the criticism has involved reaction to different editions of the novel, right? Because,
yeah, obviously, yeah.
Different interpretations have emerged out of a couple of significant different textual variations. But the main argument, starting in the 1940s and 50s, was, you know, there's a famous controversy about whether the novel represented what was called a testament of acceptance, in which case Veer did the right thing, and Melville thought that, you know, this had to happen because evil usually wins, but we can accept that fact that, you know, what Veer did was necessary under the conditions he faced. The other argument is that this was a hideous miscarriage of justice. This argument is called, you know, the testament of irony. That Melville is being ironic when there's any positive descriptions of Veer. The blessing that Billy gives to Veer is intended to be ironic. So this was the big argument in the 1950s and 60s. We're kind of way beyond that now, but you know, a lot of the argument today is the fact that people think, well, this is a text that can never be definitively interpreted because of the inherent unfinished nature, that Melville did not create a final message for his readers, you know, positive or negative about Veer, that it's a radically ambiguous text.
I find this kind of humorous. Do people actually believe that any of Melville's texts can be definitively interpreted? I mean, I'm kind of under the impression that the beautiful thing about literature is the variety of interpretations.
Yeah, exactly. No, I agree. The question is, you know, in that case, it was a deliberate ambiguity. In this case, it's a sort of, you know, textual ambiguity, which will never allow you an opportunity to, you know, it's more radically disengaged from any sort of positive critical statement about the book. I mean, it's one school of criticism. But of course, you know, we've talked all about the archetypal associations of these characters, the historical associations, I mean, the biographical associations. I mean, there's a ton of, you know, traditional connections you can make with Melville's work and his life and whatnot. So it's just that in some senses there's some issues that you can't really definitively judge because there was no final vetting of this manuscript, no final revision that sort of pulled some loose ends together. I mean, there, you know, a few places where people see sort of paradoxes that might have been, you know, resolved, or contradictions or whatnot.
Well, I'll say this. I mean, you brought together a lot of the puzzle pieces for me and a lot of the loose ends. I mean, I think I have even a greater appreciation of the text after our conversation today.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
I hope, did we cover everything that you wanted to cover?
Yeah, pretty much.
Well, yeah, I thought it was a great session.
Yeah.
I think it was, you know, I mean, it's just absolutely incredible, the authority that you bring to these conversations about these texts, you know. I hope I demonstrate that with the Kierkegaard stuff. Maybe one day, maybe. So
Well, yeah, and the great thing about Billy Budd is, I mean, you can read it in one sitting, so it's a book that you can reread many times and
yes,
still continue to think about, and especially for people who are interested in law and literature, it's like the text for everyone who likes to study the intersection of those two fields. It's a popular area of study for academic critics today.
cool. Well, let's bring this
Okay.
to a close, and we will be back soon. We're going to negotiate off air, but we're going to be talking about Dr. Cook's book next week. Mark, do you want to tell people where they can find your book if they want to prepare for the seminar?
Yeah. Okay. Well, my book, Inscrutable Malice, Northern Illinois University Press. It's
You can get it on Amazon,
yeah, get
right?
it on Amazon. Yeah, it's in print, very much available. It's only in hardback, but it's not outrageously expensive online. So
It's a beautiful book. I can't wait
yeah,
to read it. So,
yeah.
yeah, we'll be back shortly with
Okay,
a discussion of Dr. Cook's book. Thank you so much.
sure. See you.